In a matter of weeks, the Russian autocrat has erased his country's prosperity in a feckless attempt to rebuild a doomed empire. Despite Vladimir Putin's propensity to use public assets for his own personal benefit, and that of his former KGB cronies, by the 23rd of February 2022, the day before Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the country had paid off its debts, built up sizable foreign reserves, and for the most part maintained a budget surplus. To be sure, Putin's hardening autocracy, especially after his return to the Kremlin in 2012, worked against further socioeconomic gains rather than in their favor. After 2014 and the annexation of Crimea from Ukraine, and just as the global pandemic began in 2020, real wages were dropping, wealth inequality was rising, and foreign investment had fallen to levels not seen since 2003. The toll on Ukrainians is far greater than on Russians in material terms and, tragically, in lives lost. Ukrainian bravery in the face of Russian barbarism, however, has made Ukrainians a nation of heroes, while Russians have been rendered international pariahs, unable to travel abroad easily and suffering under the heaviest sanctions ever imposed anywhere in world history. The burden of Putin's war on Ukraine will be borne by average Russian citizens for decades, if not longer. The damage done to Russian society, the economy, its military, its political development, and its international reputation will far outlive Putin. Here are some of the ways in which Putin has managed to ruin Russia. Number 1. The Pariah Economy. The most obvious catastrophe that Putin has brought about by invading Ukraine is and will be economic. Scholars at Yale Business School reported that more than 1,000 international companies had curtailed or shuttered their businesses in Russia by the 8th week of the war. More will surely follow. Most Russians won't feel much pain from the shutdown of Aston Martin or Burberry, but the unavailability of repair and replacement items from companies such as Apple, Bombardier, Boeing, DuPont, Ericsson, Intel, and Analog Devices will hit labor productivity, consumers, and eventually the supply and production chain of Russian industry. These exits will also leave hundreds of thousands more Russians unemployed. Longer term, with Putin and the Duma threatening to confiscate any remaining assets of companies that have quickly fled Russia, few foreign investors will return anytime soon. It is sadly reminiscent of what happened to the Russian economy when the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917. At the end of January 2022, Russia had amassed $630 billion in foreign reserves, the fourth largest in the world. But Russia has no access to about half of that sum now because the funds that are held in foreign banks are now under sanction. Putin is turning Russia into an autarky. It's effectively heading back to the USSR. Number 2. A closed society. This long list of damage to the Russian economy will continue to unravel all the health and demographic gains that Russia had made before the February invasion. Population growth had leveled off by 2018 or so, reversing the demographic catastrophe of the late Soviet period and 1990s. But Putin's invasion of Ukraine has hastened what had already been called the Putin exodus of educated young professionals that had begun after 2015. The BBC reported in mid-March that as many as 25,000 Russians had already arrived in Georgia, while others went to Turkey and Armenia because airspace to Europe and North America was closed to Russian flights. One estimate put the number of Russians who had fled the country in the first 4 weeks of the war at up to 200,000. Number 3. Destroying Russia's standing in the world. Finally, Putin's war has ruined Russia's reputation abroad. In the months preceding the war, as Russian forces amassed on Ukraine's border, both he and his diplomats consistently maintained that Russia had no intention of invading, and then of course, without provocation, they did just that. They acted in bad faith in violating repeated ceasefires to allow Ukrainian civilians to evacuate cities such as Mariupol before the Russian military turned them into rubble. The Russian military has violated the laws of war in clearly targeting civilians throughout Ukraine, and Russian soldiers and their commanders have used rape and torture against civilians in Bucha and elsewhere. And so, the cycle is complete. 3 decades after the collapse of the Soviet Empire, Russians are being dragged back in time to when Soviet citizens lived isolated from the rest of the world, in a bubble of failed ideology and misinformation. That system fell apart under just the kind of autarky and autocracy that Putin hopes to reimpose. Just as the Soviet system collapsed, Putin is also failing Russia, erasing the gains of the post-communist period in a feckless attempt to rebuild a doomed empire. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe and smash the like button for more videos.